Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Priceless Advice with Leaders of Volunteers. I am Dana Litwin, and I am very, very excited to have first-time guest on the channel and the show, Monica Jasso, CVA. Yay, Monica, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Dana. Happy to be here. It's an
Yeah,
honor.
I reached out to you because one, you're doing important work, and we were having a lot of conversations that weren't being recorded, I think, I hope, about the current state of the sector and particularly around Latinx volunteers and the impacts of the current political climate in the USA kind of drastically changing from the norms that have come before and the protections for people that have come before. And the number one question I think any leader or volunteer has is, how do I recruit? We constantly get asked about like recruiting people, retaining people, reaching out to specific demographics or groups or people in certain areas or neighborhoods. I think that sometimes there's so much happening in the world and it's such a pace, such a startling or frightening pace of actions that are occurring now in the US politically against the nonprofits and specifically targeting, illegally and unconstitutionally targeting groups. I've noticed a chilling effect on recruitment retention, and that's kind of what sparked our conversation to have you on the show is some kind of specific impacts, and we can't ignore what's going on in the country, in the world, in the sector in general, and just hope that, oh, I'm just going to keep recruiting people in the same way that I always have, and I'm just going to ignore politics and it's be fine. And I think we're past that point. So what do you have to say about that?
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm just really happy to have a space to kind of further the discussion and the thoughts that are happening in the current time. So for me personally, working, living on the border community between, Texas and Mexico, and New Mexico, our bordering state, when I see all of these recent events unravel, um, it's saddening and also disheartening because here we were working so hard, so fast, so focused on
Hmm.
engaging everybody into volunteerism, and it feels like we've, taken 5 steps back. And so I wonder through all of this what effect it's having on our brown communities. Um, and to maybe even more important in the discussion, Dana, is like I'm also not seeing it discussed, right, in our sector, in our field.
Me neither.
I'm
That's
not
why I
seeing,
wanted to have this conversation very
yeah,
specifically.
yeah, and I don't
Yeah.
think it's intentional at all. I think we're all sort of in shock and awe
Hmm.
and disbelief and trying to figure out how it's going to affect us and how we deal with it. At least that's me.
Hmm.
But I have been keeping a really close eye on my community, volunteers coming in. We have a lot of Mexican nationals that come and volunteer at my organization. So I also go to a lot of talks in the community from experts on the ground of immigration and have seen how that's affected um, their operations, the grants, and it's chilling. I think it's chilling, and it's kind of like that quiet before something happens that we're
Hmm.
trying to deal with it. But I am happy to have the conversation and see if other communities are feeling the same way, what results they're seeing, and I think we're trying to figure it all together and what to do next.
I'm going to yes and all of that, sadly, because the point is to have a chilling effect, to shock people into silence. And I think I've noticed that it's creating a, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Like those are pretty typical neurological responses to some sort of threat or something causing fear or causing harm or causing pain, which all of this is in great
Right.
amounts. And I'm noticing all of those. Like there are people who I know from mutual aid groups and my own history of queer activism in late 80s, 90s, and in my youth. And I was hoping I was beyond that in my life and I
Mhm.
could kind of relax now.
Mhm.
There's no relaxing, but
No,
there are people
no.
who are fighting, and it's good to amplify that and to get that information. And then there are people who genuinely are fleeing, are in flight mode for their own safety, particularly friends of mine, people I know in the trans community. If they have the means, they're leaving states or trying to leave the country,
Mhm.
but that's getting more difficult to do as well. But there's also people who are freezing, like you said, where not enough people are talking about this in the immediate impacts, or at least I'd like to see it in wider conversations beyond nonprofits or local government agencies that handle immigration status, refugee, asylum, things that are, absolutely international law for any country to adhere
Right.
to, basic human rights. So there's groups that are doing good work, but it's been really disappointing aside from, say, national Council of Nonprofits, some national alliances, Alive, things like that for our profession. But there's been too much silence or fawning from, I think, philanthropy in general and other larger nonprofits that are complying in advance, which we know is the worst possible thing you can do in this situation,
Mhm.
is to
Mhm.
go, oh, I better completely change my behavior and
Right.
my language. And
Right.
then they came for me, like no one's remembering the poem, right? We have to stick together for that. And in our previous conversations, Monica, we were talking about kind of Latinx volunteerism in general, even before these changes started to happen, and kind of the lack of volunteer demography metrics are challenging too, because a lot of agencies aren't measuring this as
Yes.
as an impact to recruitment and retention. They're like, oh, where did people go? One solution I saw in a webinar a few weeks ago with specifically an organization that serves immigrants and refugees in California's Central Valley was that they're not having client meetings at the building anymore in case of an ICE or Border Patrol raid. They're doing
Mhm.
more things remotely. So there are ways to take actions to protect your volunteers, your paid staff, your clients, yourself, whatever the situation is. But that information is, 50 or 100 people on a webinar at a time and not in the major publications or news sources. And it's been a long time problem that most organizations either don't understand that they need to track volunteer demographics and impacts on retention, or they just don't have, it's a department of one with no technology or VMS. They don't have the bandwidth to do it. Are you
Yeah.
seeing that where you are in
Yeah.
Texas?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the bigger topic I wanted to talk about, Dana, because in preparing for a workshop I did recently on Latinx engagement,
Hmm.
I went back to all my sources. I looked for news sources. I read reports on volunteerism from United Nations, from Peace Corps, from our national organizations, from Canadian. And it is so hard to find demography data on volunteers. And I think we need to talk about it. Like, why is that? So I know when I worked for a larger federated national model, any volunteers coming in had the option to answer these set of questions. So
Hmm.
it wasn't required, it was an option. So I think that would be the bare minimum that we could all do, so that if the individual wants to provide that, we have that. But even in some recent reports that came out, I'm seeing demographics on the makeup of volunteers and professionals,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which is a
Toby
lot
does
of
great
work,
work with that every
a lot
year.
of
Yeah.
work to
Toby
be done
Johnson.
there,
Yeah.
but I'm not seeing the same reflected in what do our volunteers look like.
Hmm.
And I worry that now with everything happening, that's not definitely not going to be a focus area, but I think we need to push forward on that. Because my goal in looking for that and studying that and researching that is to see if our volunteers look like the communities that we have, that we serve, that we want to engage. And
Exactly.
without that data, there's no way of telling. And you're in the blind, basically. You're in the dark.
Yeah. And you can't make data driven decisions or really any good decisions without a holistic view of information and,
Yeah.
again,
And more
variables.
importantly,
Yeah.
yeah, and more importantly, as achievement-oriented individuals that many of us are, we can't track whether our DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, like action plans are working, right? We can't benchmark where we're at and if what we're doing is working or not. And so that's my real surprise in all of this, is that there's not demography data on volunteers, especially of course in this country, because that's where most of my workshops and work is. But then I try to mirror, what I do in my current place of employment. And most of the population is 82% Hispanic,
Hmm.
Latinx. And in the lieu of everything happening, Dana, I'm trying to see how can we make it more equitable, right? Like, what are other people doing that's, revolutionary in terms of background checks, for example? That's a barrier.
Yeah, background checks are a huge barrier. I've talked about that in a lot of other videos and Tuesday tips and things over the years. And that kind of gets to another fundamental or core topic of volunteerism, which is trust. So if people don't trust an institution to protect them or their data, they don't want to give up demographic data, because we're in a time in the US and other countries as well, unfortunately falling to far right extremism and fascism, that that kind of data is either being erased or weaponized against the
Right.
groups. And there are so many apps that everyone thinks are fun that, are 23andMe or data, DNA thing, DNA test. All of that is data mining and something to be leveraged for good or for bad. And we're in a time where we have to be, I think, more precious with what we're entrusted with volunteers as individual leaders of volunteers, and also in our organizations, of trying to hold that safety net or safe place for people to do good work in their communities and
Right.
still be a part of a community and not feel frightened or hiding or divided. And that's really tough to do when the officials or the people that are supposed to enforce laws, which have never been fair in our justice system, so I'm going to acknowledge that they're flawed, but even some basic protections are just being ignored or deliberately crossed as far as civil rights and human
Right.
rights. So, how are you with your organization, or how are you thinking about kind of holding up that foundation of trust, and how it's that lack of trust or is affecting Latinx and Hispanic communities?
Oh, yeah, trust is huge. I think, having come from a customer service background very heavily, which is what we do, right? Volunteering, we're all customer service. Like, trust is the core of everything. And so I'm blessed to be in an organization that is trustworthy, has the trust of the community for the most part. Not every organization is perfect, but I'm blessed to have that. But even to your point, like, if you don't have trust, you can't even engage with the
Yeah,
communities you're wanting to engage. You won't get in,
yeah.
right? And when I do Latinx workshops on engagement, trust is it. Like, you got to start baby steps and participate and get involved and support that organization, that community. That's how you build trust. It has to be a two-way road. But I'm seeing definitely effects of eroding trust in seeing other nonprofit colleagues besides me losing jobs,
Mhm.
moving operations across the border into a different country that they may not be able to work at. Even just where I work, it's a downtown area. The traffic of people is not the same,
No, not at all.
right?
Yeah.
Because it's and I mean, you feel the trust eroding around you. What I try to do is of just stay firm in our values and that we are for all, and engage with as many individuals as possible, support as many of these marches, protests, talks, organizations. I mean, just simple calls of support to, leaders of organizations that are being marginalized even more so now. I think that's where we're at. And then also looking at the processes and framework. And where we can do better, because we've known for a long time we can do better. And coming from a, a Latinx background, seeing this very Americanized structure of volunteering that's very formal and always trying to informalize it to appeal to more community members,
Hmm.
looking for ways to do that, right? So who does need the background check? Do we need to do this application? Do they need uniforms for this, right? All of those questions to ask is where I'm at right now and seeing what we can do.
Yeah, and we're recording this in middle of March, and
Mhm.
Cesar Chavez Day is on March 31st, so this will come out in April. But what are some ways to show up with trust in time in these times in general? May 1st is May Day. It's a big workers' rights kind of holiday around the world as well. And those are all things that are, again, specifically being targeted for erasure, for dismissal, for persecution, prosecution, that in your organization in dealing with that, not only noticing the lack of traffic, but how can someone maybe trust you in the organization, but then there could very well, and not just specifically your organization, but what I'm seeing is that leaders of volunteers are showing up to the moment fairly well with courage and conviction. And then we see something like the executive director orders someone to erase all evidence of DEI from the website so they don't potentially lose grant money. So again, that's that fawning reaction behavior that's a common psychological reaction to this kind of situation. Are you seeing that in either your organization or others serving the similar community, or are people being like, nope, we keep the words, we keep the things, there are other donors that step up, we turn to the community for small donations if this corporation is turning heel? Are you seeing impacts at that level yet?
I'm seeing our organization and others have really bound the values to be equitable, diverse, and inclusive. And so to that point, they're not budging, right? And
Good.
I'm happy to see that. There is a radar that's out there to see what the potential impacts may be,
Mm-hmm.
but sticking really true to those values, I'm happy to say for sure. What I'm really happy to see, Dana, to be a little more optimistic. I know we need that
We
right
want some
now.
good news in here
I
too.
mean, I
It's
gotta
not.
tell you, it was hard. It was hard, and it has been hard. And I didn't think I really understood that hope is a verb
Mm-hmm.
until November,
Yeah.
right? And it's not always easy, but we choose to hope. But what I have since then been very happy, content, and taken solace in is really the community networking.
Mm-hmm.
So the collaborating at a grassroots level. I spent my Sunday, this past Sunday, 2 hours listening to educators getting together to make sure that our history is being taught, regardless of what's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Alternative types of schooling, about the history of Cesar Chavez and that movement for farm workers. And so I'm seeing like this resurgence at the grassroots level that is not always televised and promoted on purpose, but I'm seeing that and I'm really happy about that. And I'm trying to get involved and be supportive of all of that. There's a lot of that is happening here on the border, I can tell you for sure. And we're all very much like-minded, so we're supporting each other in how we can and building that network of resiliency.
I, I
So
yeah. Go
yeah.
ahead.
And to the Cesar Chavez Day, it's a Monday, and
Mm-hmm.
so I will be at the march. If we can support. If we can learn. I think that's a big part. Education, self-awareness. That's where I would start, if nothing else.
I think that's a great place to start with, where one should always be on a professional and personal journey of learning something new every day and learning from each other, not just one
Mhm.
person saying this is how things are and everybody listen to me, although that happens far too often and that's the mindset of the people who think they're in control right now. But that grassroots level and that informal volunteering, I want to circle back because we touched on it a little bit earlier in the conversation, but I am also seeing anecdotally, I don't have research data on this yet because I don't think anybody's doing it right now because we're all in shock and response mode.
Right.
But I am seeing that particularly in the Los Angeles fires in January, and I have family, a ton of family and friends down there, and I grew up in Southern California originally before I moved to San Francisco. And what I saw was that mutual aid, Los Angeles mutual aid, and particularly mask blocks for respirators for wildfire smoke that have been around supporting people for COVID safety for years, like suddenly the mutual aid and the mask block were able to help people in a way that large organizations, including Red Cross and FEMA and more official, or like you said, kind of larger, more institutional, formal things, were not. They were doing good work. It takes all of those in the ecosystem. We don't want to remove them from helping people, but the immediate needs were being met for weeks for that first month after the fires by mutual aid groups, almost entirely. I've spoken of this trend before of not just in 2024, 2025, but the world in general, particularly in a change of political winds for the worse for this sector, because anyway you slice it, it's a worse situation than we were in a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And climate change and everything coming together as complex systems, people are falling back to that hyper local mutual aid. Some
Yes.
online stuff. There's a whole entirely volunteer run data rescue team and operation happening, trying to save scientific data and mirror it and archive it before it's erased by the current administration. So there are definitely informal and grassroots and mutual aid things that are strengthening. And I actually encourage leaders of volunteers, and I'm glad you're doing it yourself, to get more aware and involved in that, not just to potentially partner if possible, if that's
Right.
beneficial to both organizations and not just trying to take over an informal one with yours, but create those informal partnerships with groups that may not even have official nonprofit status. It may be more of a loose affiliation or alliance in your area of mutual aid. And I've shared the link before, and I'll put it in the video description of mutualaidhub.org that kind of shows where these things are. But we're also in an area where you want to share information, but you want to be also mindful of people's safety and security and what's called OPSEC, operational security, so that you're not accidentally sharing demographic or personal information or something that can be made into a target by
Right.
a
Right.
government agency or a militia or other kind of
Yes.
unofficial brown shirt stochastic violence situation. So are you finding that there's people are trying to have a balance with that? Like, yeah, we want to share information with each other, but we also have to be careful to a degree of how far that information gets out so it can't be used against us. Are you
Yeah.
getting to that point yet?
Yeah, absolutely. So in trying to, I love my community. I'm born and raised here. Love my community. Very rich culture, people, weather. Um, I am seeing that. And me trying to get involved in more organizations that are responding to the moment that we're in. I am seeing that. I'm seeing, hey, we're going to get together, but it's not promoted heavily.
Mm-hmm.
Or, hey, we're here, no video, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or we just had a discussion. I was at an event Sunday where we want to get the word out on these events. How do we do that safely?
Right.
Right? We opted for no social media, just a website,
Mm-hmm.
no options to comment, anything like that. Just we are having those conversations. And I'll say for this conversation and something that maybe other parts of the country are not thinking about is very early on I went to a panel of experts on immigration,
Mm-hmm.
nonprofit leaders that are on the line every day. And the advice they gave that would stay with me all the time, and it happened to me actually, I had to use it, is don't ask, don't tell your
Yeah.
status.
Yeah.
And it happened to be that there was a woman who helps us at her house who his family's been affected by everything and tells me the status of, some of her family members and then continues to ask for jobs and things like that. And so that's an example of the things happening here in this community. And the more we can spread the word, don't ask, don't tell, you come to me, we will help you. We don't need to know XYZ. And so that kind of then goes back, Dana, to our original thought of demography data. It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of counterintuitive, right?
Right.
Like we want to know the demography data of the volunteers, but do we want to know all the statuses and potentially put them in danger or lose their trust? So those two things are at odds.
Well, and that's always the balance in any nonprofit or government organization or any service that's a social safety net or of assistance to people, assistance benefits, that there's usually a lot of paperwork, a lot of means testing. And this is why mutual aid was kind of faster and more nimble and effective than more formal organizations where like you
Mhm.
fill out 5 pages of forms with 5 different agencies and then maybe you get a check in 2 months
Yeah,
kind of a thing.
right.
But there's always been a balance of confidentiality, personal privacy with, but we'd love to have the data to know, are we reflect not just anecdotally or on the surface, but are we reflective of the community that we work with? And if not, how can we be better at that? So that's kind of, been DEI in current times. And with that word suddenly turned into a term that's supposed to be banned by weirdly sensitive people that are offended by
Mhm.
letters and words in certain orders that I don't understand. It gets down to that fundamental balance of, can somebody trust you with their information, and particularly around a background check where that's a huge barrier to people participating, especially in these current times where lawlessness is ruling and laws are changing or being ignored and or enforced in from the 1800s. It's technically still a law in the book, but everyone's been ignoring for 150 years. So there's these
Mhm.
these weird, unprecedented, unconstitutional legal things happening in the country where your data could just be sucked up by Elon Musk at Doge
Mhm.
through from a federal agency. So
Right.
it's got all our social security numbers. So there's some real dangers, and with data mining and lack of privacy and surveillance that are happening. And I think it does take these smaller networks, informal mutual aid, where that's where people are directly working with others in their own community that are reflective of their experience or enculturation or background. That's a lot easier to trust.
Mhm.
You talked about you can't even get a conversation with Latinx or Hispanic or Latine communities. I saw this happen about 10 years ago. As with a local government agency. So we were in better, more hopeful times and not in the distress that we're all in right now. But we were trying to do outreach to East San Jose, which was largely Vietnamese and Spanish speaking folks in less economically advantaged neighborhoods. But again, that income inequality of typical of Silicon Valley and this whole area of Northern California, where
Mhm.
it's like the hyper
Mhm.
rich tech people and then everybody else.
Mhm.
And we had our rangers and maintenance people in uniforms thinking like everybody loves a park ranger, right? Because this was a
Mhm.
conservation agency, an open space agency, just to do surveys. And nope, slam doors. There's a uniform and a badge coming toward my door. Nobody's home. And
Yeah.
it took that first wave of research for even when it was, another dark skinned, brown skinned, or or Vietnamese person coming to the door, just like the uniform was enough. Even 10 years ago, there's always been this concern of and distrust of certain authorities, institutions, government agencies with good cause because of the history of this country and the current state we're in. But even 10 years ago, we realized right away, oh, our methodology, this is not going to work. And we shifted to community center, library, neighborhood association sponsored town halls and just meet and greets where we had food, we had booths of nature games and toys and things for kids to do. We had educational animals where we could have just informal conversations. Again, like we're not asking about anybody's immigration status. We're not asking about your background. We're asking
Right.
how you want to. The whole point of the research was how can we, as an agency who offers free services, there's no charge to come into our parks. We have all these free educational programs in multiple languages. How can we best work with you and serve you? And do you want to volunteer, or do you want to apply for a staff position? So it really was just the most basic of outreach for good things. And there still was a huge barrier to trust because we were officially an organization that had rangers in uniforms.
Yeah. And I'll say, when I worked at a larger federated organization with uniforms, we realized that early on. And add to that, Dana, the National Park uniform rangers and the Border Patrol uniform.
Exactly the same, almost exactly the same. Yeah.
Right,
Or a
right.
sheriff, a sheriff.
Yes.
I used to
The
be a park
hats.
ranger, yeah, and I was mistaken for a sheriff 60% of the time if I was just running an errand outside of the park, like lunch or something. So it'd be
Right,
like, oh, sheriff, da da da, somebody just did this on my car. It's like, I work in the park,
right.
man. I'm
No,
here to
yeah,
talk
and
about
those are,
nature. I don't want to arrest anybody.
yeah, and I think that's just the whole part of that
Yeah.
whole institutionalized, formalized systems that we as Americans, Americanized,
Hmm.
understand, but other communities do not. And it affects the trust for sure.
And I want to also circle back. You had a great point about the informal versus formal volunteering in Hispanic and Latinx communities, that there are, when we're only thinking, and this happens so much in conservation, I saw this throughout my whole career in that subsector as well, that there's this very mistaken thinking that, oh, every other culture that we could possibly interact with as volunteers has a word for volunteerism in their language, understands that idea, and will absolutely align with our, majority white North American enculturated ideals of what that means, and what's that, even that definition of engagement to that community. And that hasn't always been completely wrong way to approach
Right.
community, or to build trust, or to start these conversations. If you want to do specific outreach, not just to Hispanic or Latinx, but LGBTQIA, like any community that considers itself its own group and wants to have solidarity together, that's going to be more and more difficult to gain that group's trust if they're on this ever-growing list of groups that are illegally and unfairly targeted.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you said that because it was an epiphany of mine a couple years ago, and I posted about it that there is no word for volunteer in Spanish.
No, there isn't.
There's a voluntario, which is a male volunteer, voluntaria, but though there's definitely no verb for volunteer in Spanish, right? It's help is the closest thing, ayudar.
Hmm.
And so that spoke volumes to me. And it's since then kind of framed how I look at different languages and cultures. And something I've also related to that, been looking into and trying to research, Dana, is the any models of volunteerism in indigenous communities, because my
There's
word
so little
for
data on that. It's so
so
hard to
I
find
can't
that.
find
Yeah.
anything. And
Yeah.
because my word of the year is to re-indigenize, get to my roots,
Hmm.
and reciprocation is what it comes out. And by definition, right, that means you give and take equally, which is almost counter to our concept of volunteering as more of a transaction. Give you my time for service. So it's really fascinating to see how those words matter and the concepts that go with it.
And I've been trying for years, and I know so has Tobey Johnson and Steinhorn and Rob Jackson, and there's a lot of people in the field, Tracy O'Neill in Australia,
Mhm.
that we should not be transactional, we should be transformational in how we're approaching volunteer engagement, volunteerism, working in teams, whatever they call that, and that there are many, many cultural backgrounds or faith backgrounds where it's just inherent that you help each other, not just within your own family, but
Right.
your immediate neighbors, the people who speak your language, the people who are from your local town or city or country. If you've had to flee violence and come somewhere else for safety, that doesn't that it's just such an understood concept
Hmm.
that to try to North Americanize it or Westernize
Yes.
it with like, and yes, we're going to plant a flag and you're going to have a uniform and it's going to be, very official and there's going to be a lot of paperwork
Yes.
and like,
Yes.
and that all comes from, the founding of America and the destruction of the indigenous peoples here with Calvinism, Puritanism,
Hmm.
like that still ripples through history.
Yes.
My mom's side of the family came over here in the 1640s. I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Same.
My dad was Jew. My dad's family was Jewish immigrants fleeing between the world wars, but I'm so sorry about my mom's colonizer side of the family in Hingham, Massachusetts. But we have to acknowledge that all of these things throughout history into our current times are drastically impacting how we're able to do our work. So while there's the shock and awe that's purposeful and trying to get people to just freeze or fawn or flee and not put up a
Hmm.
fight or comply in advance, that's all on purpose, and it's all a playbook that we all know very well from the last 100 years, and that America has already fallen into on too many occasions, with the initial manifest destiny of Native Americans, with the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. So when I see mostly middle-aged white ladies who look like me shocked that, like, well, how can we be here? Where does this, like, no, 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 because we haven't learned our history or been aware or talking about the patterns of American history that led us to this moment that were never fully fixed or resolved, even though we're making progress. But now that particular group that's been behind all those cruel, terrible ideas over the years, or that ideology, now they're really trying to force everybody else into their very narrow belief system.
Hmm.
And there's always been that tension in the United States or Western culture in general, but especially here in the United States, there's always been that tension of our ideals that we want to strive for and the fact that, yeah, slavery and oppression and white supremacy and dehumanization is baked into the original recipe. It's extra crispy now, but it's baked into the original recipe of the whole
Super extra
thing.
crispy. I like that.
Kentucky Fried.
I love, yeah, I hadn't heard that. I like, yeah, that definitely strikes a point for sure.
People trust each other who speak the same language and look like them. That's just a natural primate human trait
Hmm.
of all of the human species that have ever existed, or one being left. And that investment in long-term community relationships, it takes intention and it is long term. And I think too many people or too many organizations think we're going to throw up a poster with a rainbow on it for June for Pride, and that's going to make
Hmm.
us cool with the gays all year. I have a
Hmm.
whole presentation about why that's not true.
Right.
That's going to be at Points of Light, and I think ideally you're going to be at Points of Light as well. Is that true?
Yes, I cannot wait. It's yeah,
Yay!
I'm looking forward to it. I'll see you there, Dana, and hopefully a lot of other people.
Yeah, and hopefully a lot of other people. This is a long-term fight. Hope is action. Hope is has her knuckles bloodied sometimes. Hope is not just daydreaming. That hope does
Right.
have to turn into action in times of trouble and distress for any community, and that the more communities that recognize their shared humanity in each other and can work together. Maybe they've never worked together before in a certain neighborhood or area or city or town, but like, okay, if we partner with each other, we'll be stronger in this endeavor. Our voices will be louder. We'll be able to get action items, good information for good trouble for people to get up to resist oppression
Mhm.
in all of its forms. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing you and others at Points of Light. Is there anything that you want to share from your recent life-changing travels? Anything that you noticed in your adventures in the last couple of
Oh.
weeks that can help the sector or that profoundly affected you? And again, we've had these conversations kind of before this recording,
Mhm.
but I want to capture, what was really useful to you in your recent world travels.
Right. So I recently went to Egypt and I'm still processing everything. Um, I'll put together like my top 5 moments and observations pretty soon here. But I think the first insight for me, Dana, was here I am learning about one of the most ancient civilizations in the world, but I'm seeing a lot of need, a lot of poverty. So it just goes to show myself that longevity of a nation does not equal necessarily prosperity for all. So that's kind of what my mind is dealing with. And then that takes me to think of what do the nonprofits look like there, if any. Whenever I travel to another country, I try to look volunteer in Mexico, volunteer in Egypt, and I guarantee you at least the top 5, 10 are American organizations volunteering there. So that construct is interesting to me. I'd like to look more into that. But really, the overall insight is how big the world really is and how traveling really can change your perspective on how you see your little corner of the world when you come back.
It absolutely does. And my own travels in the before times when it was safer
Mm.
to fly to exotic locales in a lot of ways have taught that to me as well, that people are people wherever you go, and people for the most part want to just live their lives. And it's a very American phrase to say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but I think that translates across a lot of different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Even someplace like where you traveled to in Egypt, and there's very clearly Western and American nonprofits operating there, and there's a balance of are you bringing genuine help to people, which many of them do, and colonial cultural mindsets that come with the organization or the people that are working at the top of the organization, and how that relates to working with the communities or doing any kind of social safety net or community service in those areas. And I've seen that in relatively prosperous Western countries, and I've seen that in countries that have their own very distinct culture, and some national or international nonprofit comes in and says, this is the way we do things with our forms and our processes. And everyone's like, what are you talking about? We just give food to
Right,
people. Why do we need a license for that? We cook food
right.
for our neighbors when the earthquake hits, or whatever the case may be. Thank you so, so much, Monica, for being on Priceless Advice. It's fantastic to talk to you. Finally, not just all these little
Yes,
online conversations. And I look forward to seeing
me
you
too.
in person at Points of Light in June in New Orleans. And I'll put the registration links. If anyone else, any other leaders or volunteers are going to be at Points of Light, come up to me. I'll have my COVID safe mask on, but I still give great hugs and high fives and elbow bumps or whatever you like as a greeting. And I'm going to find a way to do karaoke with a mask on while I'm there. So I
Yes,
invite everyone to that as well. I might be
count
bringing some
me.
musical
I will be
instruments.
there.
I
I will be
probably
there.
will bring at least a couple musical instruments too, because New Orleans.
That's great. I love
Just,
it.
just,
Yes.
just because. But thank you so much, Monica Jasso, CVA, for being on the show.
Thank
And I'll
you.
have how to get in touch with you on LinkedIn in the video description below. Thank you so much for your priceless advice and Tuesday tips. And hey, everyone, we'll see you next time on the channel. Take care.